Trudy, is that a 32 ACP gun in your pocket, or are you just happy to live in a country with a Second Amendment?
Shooter!
In the late spring of 2022, with COVID restrictions lifting, we saw the return of major news coverage of a far older disease that has long plagued the United States: mass firearm violence. The events that occurred in May in Uvalde, Texas, and Buffalo, New York, as well as on Independence Day in Highland Park, Illinois, shocked and disgusted the nation and reignited the issue of gun control in American politics that had remained more on the back burner through 2 years of lockdown. As of June, there had already been 246 mass shootings in the United States, which includes any incident that harmed 4 or more people. Clearly, there is a sickness that's affecting the nation, and it's not just the COOF. It's crime, and that crime is often carried out using firearms. However, gun culture remains an important part of much of what it means to be an American for many citizens, and the Second Amendment protects the rights of those Americans to own and utilize those firearms. Yet in the face of such tragedies as those in Uvalde and in Buffalo, Americans' opinions on gun ownership and that Second Amendment right remain strong for many, as a Supreme Court ruling regarding concealed carry in New York illustrates. But why? To understand why people are so adamant about their right to bear arms, even after tragic events, we should look to the data to not just figure out why Americans own guns and their opinions towards gun ownership, but also how Americans tend to react to these horrific incidents and how it might change or not change their opinions. Today, let's look at the research on gun ownership in America and the influence of tragedies and the media on beliefs regarding that ownership. But first, and because a lot of this video will cover the concept of self-defense, let me tell you about a way that you can defend yourself against cybersecurity threats and data breaches, which you can do with this video's sponsor, NordPass. Identity theft is a huge global problem, as illustrated in the recent conviction of former Amazon employee Paige Thompson, who in 2019 exploited cloud server vulnerabilities to steal the names, dates of birth, and social security numbers of over 100 million people. With how much of our information is now stored online, it's imperative that we protect our privacy and passwords. And NordPass helps you do just that. NordPass is a secure password manager that helps you keep track of all of your various passwords across different websites and access them all with just one master password. With NordPass, you can log into websites and check out of online shops faster without having to worry about managing all of your information individually, saving you time and hassle, all while knowing that your data is secure. The data breach scanner allows you to check up on your accounts and credit cards to be alerted in the case of a data breach and what type of data was compromised. And their password health checker can help you ensure that your passwords are robust and unique. Further, NordPass is a zero-knowledge password manager, meaning that no one but you has access to any of this information, including the Nord team. If you want to defend your privacy online, then click the link down below in the description or in the pinned comment, or use my code AYDIN, that's AYDIN, at checkout to get an exclusive deal with NordPass, plus an additional month absolutely free. If you don't love the service, don't worry, because NordPass offers a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you can be secure in your purchase as well as in your online privacy. Thanks so much to NordPass for sponsoring this video, and now that we've got our internet defense in hand, let's talk about offline defense and why it is that so many people in the United States in particular own firearms. To better understand why Americans tend to own guns, we can look to a study from Strobe, Leander, and Kruglanski 2017, who developed a two-component theory of gun ownership. The first element was not fear of a specific crime, but instead perceived threat of victimization, akin to belief in a dangerous world. Belief in a dangerous world is about what it sounds like. It's a theory that proposes that some people will always see the world as a scary and negative place, while others may have a belief in a just world, a theory which posits that some people will always see the world as just. The second factor in Strobe, Leander, and Kruglanski's proposal is that these beliefs will not just incentivize people to purchase a gun, but also that it will influence their feelings towards the right to use deadly force and defend the right to firearms politically. To begin to test this hypothesis, their first study questioned male gun owners and non-owners on their belief in a dangerous world, perceptions of lifetime risk of assault, the types of guns owned, or that the participant might be interested in owning. Their stated reasons for owning a gun, perceived effectiveness of gun ownership, under what circumstances it would be justified to shoot an intruder, under what circumstances it would be justified to shoot anyone, support for or against gun legislation, personal experience with victimization, and political orientation. Results of this first study were indicative that gun owners tended to be more likely to believe in a dangerous world and perceive greater lifetime risk compared to non-owners. Self-defense was seen as a stronger reason for gun ownership in gun owners than in non-owners, and owners were more prone to strongly believe that guns are effective as a self-defense tool. Not really that surprising if you know what they do.
Here's how a 36-grain, 22-caliber varmint grenade bullet reacts when hitting a grape.
Further, gun owners reported greater justifications in shooting an intruder, right to kill, and were more likely to advocate greater gun rights. Gun owners are also more likely to identify with the Republican, Libertarian, or Constitutionalist parties compared to non-owners. Handgun owners were the most likely to report owning guns for the purpose of self-defense compared to other firearms, which is logical as rifles and shotguns tend to be used more commonly for hunting or sport. But to better understand these results, the scholars conducted several more studies which focused specifically on gun owners. For all other types of firearms except for handguns, 45.6% of respondents gave some reason other than self-defense as their rationale for owning the gun, while only 12.4% of handgun owners had reasons outside of personal protection. Handgun ownership was related positively to belief in a dangerous world, the lifetime risk of perceived assault, and to intentions to use the firearm for protection or self-defense, while long gun ownership was negatively related to self-defense rationales. Moreover, long gun ownership was negatively associated with handgun ownership.
We don't want any more visitors, well-wishers, or distant relations.
What about the best battle implement ever devised?
M1 Karandalf!
As such, it seems that people who own handguns tend to do so for personal protection, while people who own long guns tend to do so for other reasons, largely for hunting purposes, and that these owners tend to not necessarily be the same people. Political orientation was the strongest predictor of belief in a dangerous world, and thereby indirectly to belief in ownership of firearms for the purpose of self-defense. Perceived lifetime risk, on the other hand, was most strongly influenced by prior experience with victimization, regardless of personal political orientation. A third study assessed how the belief in the right to self-defense extended beyond handgun ownership, having shown itself to be an important variable in this context. Handgun owners were surveyed on how they would deal with an intruder, the type of situations that would give someone the right to end another person's life, and personal advocacy for the right to own firearms. There was a significant relationship between belief in a dangerous world and self-defense rationales, which in turn was positively related to justification to shoot, the right to kill, and advocacy for gun rights. The same was true for these handgun owners as it concerned perceived lifetime risk and the three outcome variables. As such, handgun owners who perceived greater threats to their safety tended to be more likely to justify using firearms for the purpose of self-defense, including the right to shoot and even kill an intruder.
I own a musket for home defense, since that's what the Founding Fathers intended. 4 ruffians break into my house, the devil, as I grab my powdered wig and Kentucky rifle, blow a golf ball-sized hole through the first man, he's dead on the spot. Draw my pistol on the second man, misses him entirely because it's smoothbore and nails the neighbor's dog. I have to resort to the cannon mounted at the top of the stairs, loaded with grape shot. Tally-ho, lad! Grape shot shreds 2 men in the blast. The sound and extra shrapnel set off car alarms. Fix bayonet and charge the last terrified rapscallion. Bleeds out, waiting on the police to arrive, since triangular bayonet wounds are impossible to stitch up. Just as the Founding Fathers intended.
The fourth and final study from Strobe, Leander, and Kruglansky specifically examined the belief of gun owners immediately before and then following the shooting at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida, to understand how the shooting specifically affected people who own firearms. They found no significant differences for reasons and effectiveness of guns for the purpose of self-defense, nor for justification to shoot an intruder, right to kill, gun right beliefs, rates of handgun and long gun ownership, nor belief in a dangerous world. There were slightly lower levels after the event of perceived lifetime risk. However, this may have been due to the inclusion of a question about mass shootings being included in the second instrumentation of perceived lifetime risk that wasn't present in the first. Overall, gun owners showed no meaningful changes in defensive gun ownership tendencies after the incident at the Pulse nightclub. As such, it seems that these events do not tend to influence the feelings of gun owners towards the Second Amendment, but we'll look at that topic in far more detail in the second part of this video, because YouTube generally doesn't want you to talk about particularly spicy things, at least early on. Susan seems to prefer that you wait about 10 minutes or so before jumping into the deep end on heavy topics. Because belief that the world is a dangerous place was so frequently positively related to gun ownership, to better understand who owns guns or who is supportive of the Second Amendment and why, we should look to factors that may induce those beliefs. And one of the factors that has been extensively assessed in relationship to this belief is exposure to television media. So much of what we see on TV is focused on violence, be it true crime, legal procedural dramas, police reality programs, or just the daily news, which almost always benefits from having more eyes on the screen when covering some tragedy. And as such, media scholars have long suggested that exposure to this constant deluge of violence creates a perception in viewers that the world is a far more dangerous place than it really is, an effect known as the Meanworld Hypothesis. In line with these kinds of expectations, Holbert, Shaw, and Kwok, 2004, examined media consumption in relationship to beliefs about guns. Subjects were questioned in the years of 1999 and 2000 on their television viewing habits, support for the police, fear of crime, opinions on the death penalty, support for gun ownership, and actual gun ownership. Viewing police reality shows was related to support for authorities, while watching crime dramas was slightly negatively related to support for the police, but only in one of the 2 years assessed. Those who spent more time watching the news tended to be more afraid of crime, as did those who viewed police reality television programs. Reality shows and crime dramas were both positively related to increased support for the death penalty, while television news consumption was negatively related to favorability towards capital punishment, although, again, only in one of these two samples. Support for police authority and fear of crime were both significant positive predictors of attitudes towards the death penalty, with support for the police being the strongest single predictor. Only police reality programs were related positively to support for handgun ownership or actual handgun ownership. In 1 year of assessment, TV news viewership was negatively related to attitudes towards firearms, but this relationship was not consistent. Support for police authority and fear of crime were consistent, however, and both served as positive predictors of attitudes towards gun ownership. There was also an indirect relationship between watching police reality programs and gun ownership as mediated through fear of crime. That is, people who watch Cops or similar shows and who are also more worried about criminality are more likely to own a handgun, but this was not the case for viewers of the news or crime dramas. What we can surmise from these findings then is that people who watch the news don't actually tend to be more likely to own a gun in general, nor does fear of being a victim of crime influence that viewership in a manner that seemingly encourages gun ownership, but watching police reality shows does.
See, at the courthouse, and there's a camera right over there. Gotta watch what you say about the Jews.
While a lot of time has passed since these data were collected, it would seem that seeing information, even news information about real violent crime, does not seemingly influence gun ownership. Shutton et al. Were interested in better understanding why some Americans own guns while others do not, looking specifically at sensitivity to harm and childhood socialization. A national U.S. sample of 1,100 adults sourced from YouGov polling were questioned on whether or not they owned a gun or multiple guns, if they were taught to shoot or exposed to firearms as a child, how upset they were by acts of violence and permissive of self-defense, as well as queried on their beliefs in a dangerous world, political orientation, religiosity, past victimization, trust in the police, and trust in the government. Regression analysis revealed a significant negative relationship between sensitivity to harm and gun ownership, while childhood socialization was positively related to ownership. As with other research, conservative political beliefs and being from the South both predicted owning a gun, but so did racial resentment, but not in the direction that the authors anticipated, and probably not the way most people in the current year would either. That is, people with less racial animosity were more likely to own a gun. Lower levels of education, greater income, and being married all also predicted ownership as well. Having been previously victimized, being confident in the government, and being white were all significantly related to the quantity of guns owned, but not to gun ownership in and of itself. To summarize then, the people who tend to be drawn towards purchasing a firearm are not going to be white racists, but instead conservative married men of any race who tend to have been the victim of a crime, make a good deal of money, but aren't necessarily the most well-educated, who were taught about guns from an early age and own guns for the purposes of self-defense, not racism.
Time for the heavy stuff. Clack, clack, buckshot! And then if you got a friend with him, I got one more bird shot left, and I repeat the cycle. After that, nigga, it's slugs for everybody.
There were legitimate reasons for Shutton, and I'm really not sure how that name is pronounced. Is it Shutton or Shootin? But for thematic consistency, I'm gonna say it's Shootin.
Boo! You stink!
I just can't be bothered trying to pronounce everyone's name right anymore, because I somehow manage to mess it up every time anyway. But while I'm at it, your name isn't Denny Menu, it's Dennis Milanova, you pretentious leaf.
An animal caught in a trap will gnaw off its own leg to escape. What will you do?
Anyway, where was I? Oh, right. There were legitimate reasons for Shootin' et al. To be confused by the negative relationship between racism and gun ownership, given that prior research seemed to be indicative of such a connection, as seen in a study from O'Brien et al. 2013, utilizing data from the American National Election Survey. White participants' racism, as no other racial group was included in this analysis, convenient, was measured via two instruments: the symbolic racism scale, which asks questions such as, quote, generations of slavery and discrimination have created conditions that make it difficult for blacks to work their way out of the lower class, to which disagreement would be considered racist. Make of that what you will. And the implicit associations test, a test I have numerous criticisms of which the most significant is the fact that it prima facie measures heuristic processing rather than beliefs or attitudes. Just to clarify, the implicit associations test for racism flashes images of black and white people before the participant in rapid succession, and assesses the speed of responses in associating a word with that image, either positive or negative. More expedient responses towards persons of the same race with positive words and negative words with a person of another race is considered indicative of racism.
Your test results show that you strongly prefer the company of white people.
What?
Wow, and the strongly is flashing.
As I mentioned, I have many concerns with the validity of this test, and I would imagine that from its basic description, many of you are probably also cocking an eyebrow towards it as well. But speaking of cocking, let's set those reservations regarding the instrument aside for a moment and look at the findings as to how that instrument relates to gun ownership. These researchers found that symbolic racism was related to owning a firearm. Specifically, for each 1 point increase in symbolic racism, that subject was 50% more likely to have a gun in the home, and was 28% more likely to support concealed carry permits being available for handguns. When respondents already owned a gun, the relationship between racism and opposition to banning firearms vanished, indicating perhaps a self-preserving proclivity in these particular participants. Specifically, gun ownership mediated the relationship between symbolic racism and opposition to banning handguns. Conservatives were more likely to support concealed carry permits, while subjects who identified as Republican, were from a southern state, and held anti-government sentiments were all more likely to oppose gun control legislation. What a shock. Looking just at the correlations, conservatism was very slightly related to a belief that black people were violent, and similarly, slightly to implicit racism, but was related to symbolic racism. Although I did give you all an illustration of what that instrument looks like, in that if you don't think the problems faced by the black community today are a direct result of slavery, then you're a racist according to that instrument, so again, make of it what you will. Now, given that these scholars also chose to only study white people, I can't say for sure, but it may be that the reason that this study didn't produce results that aligned with the later research from Shootin' et al. Is for that exact reason. Further, it seems fully possible from these results that white people who are racist and do want to ban guns, provided they already own one, don't tend to be Southern Republicans, which, well, is at least somewhat indicative that they very well may be Northern Democrats. Again, I can't say for sure due to the low resolution of the available information in this study, but that certainly is a potentiality, and perhaps one that was not considered by Shootin' and others who were taken aback when they conducted similar analyses, and that possibility is that racist Democrats want to own guns for themselves but take away that right from others. But again, such a conclusion cannot be drawn from these data, so it's just a theory.
But the numbers don't lie. Before this gun law was passed, I had a critically low number of guns. Now, as you can see, I have all the guns.
What we can say, only slightly more definitively, about people who tend to be in favor of gun control laws and political beliefs, specifically as it refers to Democrats, is that they may have a distinct psychological profile. And to learn more about that profile, we can look to an analysis from McCann and Zawila 2016. These scholars related the strength of state gun control legislation with extant data on statewide levels of the Big Five personality traits. The strength of these laws was drawn from the Gun Laws Matter study that rated states on a variety of variables, including everything from concealed carry permit to the ability to carry a firearm in an establishment that serves alcohol and everything in between. According to this scale, California holds the most stringent laws, scoring 47 points, while Arizona held the least, scoring -5 points, which is why California's firearms listing looks a bit like something out of Tarkov. These data were compared to state-level Big Five personality inventories, which are highly reliable when themselves compared to individual-level personality instrumentation, and have been previously associated with a plethora of other variables, including more similar issues such as smoking behavior and more dissimilar but far more important ones such as Twitter use. The big 5 personality traits are openness to experience, extroversion, conscientiousness, which is a tendency to adhere to social norms, agreeableness, and neuroticism, which is a tendency towards negative emotions, including anxiety and depression. Gun ownership, political orientation, racial and social economic information, as well as urban population density were also measured. State by state, stronger gun control laws were associated with higher openness, higher socioeconomic status, a greater percentage of the population living in urban centers, preference for the Democrat Party, lower gun ownership, and a lower percentage of white population. Although there was no direct relationship between the strength of gun laws and any of the big 5 personality traits, voting for the Democrat Party was related positively to neuroticism. Due to the persistent relationships between regions that tend to vote Democrat and those with higher urban populations, lower general socioeconomic status, and fewer white residents, we can further identify an indirect relationship between states with the strongest gun control laws that tend to be predominantly Democrat and statewide neuroticism. We're talking mass-scale instances of Larry Davidism.
1! Land!
Gosh! It's in his mouth! It was an accident! I was gonna fire in the air! Aaron Burr! I'm not Aaron Burr!
This was further confirmed using regression analysis, which allows us to determine how much one variable influences another, which found that the inclusion of neuroticism into the equation eliminated additional variance in gun control law that would be explained by the other big 5 personality traits, even when other demographic variables were included in the model. While we can't say for sure, using these data, one could extrapolate that another broad factor that differentiates those more supportive of the right to bear arms may tend to be less likely, on average, to have neurotic personality traits. In contrast to neuroticism, which may be more common in those who live in states with strict gun control laws, gun owners also may tend to just be a little bit happier. There is a common argument among some advocates for gun control legislation that the kinds of people who would even be interested in seeking out a firearm may already have some mental health issues, including antisocial personality disorder or other psychosocial problems. Why would someone buy a gun if they don't intend to use it for evil, or so the logic goes? Of course, in terms of the actual data, there is not much to see. For example, a study of the relationship between impulsive, angry behavior and gun ownership from Swanson et al. 2015 found that of Americans who report having a problem with an impulsive, angry behavior, 8.9% own a firearm, and only 1.5% carry outside the home. A report from the National Comorbidity Survey replication, which provided the basis for Swanson et al.'s analysis, was indicative that the total prevalence of intermittent explosive disorder in the US is 5.2%. Data from the National Firearms Survey show us that 22% of US adults personally own a firearm, and although we can't necessarily isolate a hard number on that, we could estimate that's about 56 million US adults. Of those, slightly under 3 million might struggle with intermittent explosive disorder, and of those, 264,000 own guns, and just 4,000 carry outside the home. As such, the portion of Americans who own a gun that they take outside their home and also struggle with an impulsive anger issue accounts for just 1% of the entire US population. Of course, having intermittent explosive disorder does not preclude that one will engage in any actual violent behavior using a firearm or not, but it's important to see the actual numbers here in detail. For comparison, data from the National Institute of Mental Health illustrates that 14 million US adults suffer from a serious mental health illness, or 5.6% of the adult population. While mental health is a reasonable concern when it comes to gun ownership, which is why people who have been interned in a mental hospital against their will lose the right to own guns in the US, it's also relevant to understand just what a small percentage of the population this stereotype is referring to, about 1%. On the other side of the debate, those who favor protection of Second Amendment rights emphasize that the ownership of firearms is predominantly for the purpose of self-defense, hunting, or competitive sport, and increase their feelings of safety and security, as we can see in Pew data. And that's all outside of the fact that the US Constitution just straight up says that right shall not be infringed. But we should still ask, how is gun ownership itself related to psychological health? For some general answers, we can look to a study from Hill et al. 2020, who conducted a meta-analysis of the relationship between firearm ownership and happiness in Americans between the years of 1973 and 2018, utilizing national-level data collected from the General Social Survey, or GSS. This survey queried respondents on their general levels of happiness and gun ownership, and the results were indicative that 31% of respondents reported being very happy, with approximately 40% reporting having a gun in their home. Using regression analysis revealed that the odds of reporting being very happy were 37% higher for those participants who owned a gun. However, the relationship was not so straightforward. Additional modeling illustrates that this increase in happiness disappears when marriage was included. But hang on, not in the direction that, again, you might expect.
I don't mean to burst your bubble here, but your mother is, she's garbage. She's pure trash, man. You know what I mean? She's a dog. Your mother's a dog. You know, all the girls you know are probably terrible.
Instead, the data were indicative that married people tend to be more likely to own a gun, and because marriage was associated with 114% odds ratios of being very happy, it's not so much that owning a gun increases happiness, but rather that married people tend to be happier and be more likely to own a firearm as well. Or maybe guns just make marriages happier, perhaps serving as a bit of a deterrent to disincentivize your wife from spending all your whiskey money on expensive Copic markers.
God damn it, I trusted you! F you! And f your marker!
Other demographic variables played no role in this increased association with happiness, including age, gender, race, education, employment status, household income, financial satisfaction, financial change, number of children, religious attendance, urban residence, region of interviewee, and survey year with one exception: political affiliation, to the surprise of, I'm sure, absolutely everyone. Or so you might think. Among Democrats, gun ownership was associated with a 12% increase in reports of being very happy, but this relationship was waning over time. The results for independents and Republicans were not uniquely elevated. As such, for the Democrats who did own guns, of which there were fewer than those of other political orientations, that ownership was seemingly uniquely related to greater happiness, although this effect, as I said, has been diminishing over time. If that seems confusing, it's possibly because gun ownership is more likely to be the norm for Republicans than it is for Democrats. So for Dems who do own guns, it has a distinct positive effect. Ultimately, however, happiness isn't really a warm gun, although gun ownership can lead to greater reports of well-being, specifically when there are other social safety systems in place for gun-owning individuals, namely marriage. An additional variable that may influence who tends to own firearms may be individualism. Using data from the GSS collected between 1972 and 1998, Selenska 2007 found a 1-unit increase in individualism increases the predicted odds ratio of owning a gun by 5%. As such, the more individualistic one tends to be, the more likely they are to own a gun. But who tends to be more or less individualistic? According to Selenska's data, individualists tended to have higher incomes, achieve higher levels of education, and reside in the South or in the mountain regions of the United States. They are also more likely to be older white males of Protestant belief with conservative political views, as we've already seen. Of all factors, being white was the strongest predictor of individualistic beliefs. Concerning gun ownership outside of individualism, having been a victim of a crime was not significantly related to gun ownership in this sample. Further, the odds ratios suggest that the most influential variables in determining gun ownership were not individualism, but rather gender and hunting status, in that male hunters tend to be the most likely people to own a firearm. Although, to be fair, there are some hunters who don't use firearms. Some folks just built different.
Here's the thing. I know I'm home alone tonight and I just heard a noise. So if there's a home intruder listening right now, I'm naked and I have a tomahawk. Now I'm about to go take a sip of some lemonade. So if when I'm done sipping on my lemonade and I hear another noise, I'm gonna sweep this house naked with my tomahawk. Now here's the thing. If when I do so naked with my tomahawk, I find someone that shouldn't be here, I'm gonna make the beaches of Normandy.
How is it that gun owners tend to be more likely to believe that the world is a dangerous place, yet mass-level data are simultaneously indicative that states lower in gun ownership are higher in neuroticism, which is typified by nervousness and anxiety towards the world? The two are seemingly contradictory, even if gun owners are a little bit happier, and maybe that's why they're less prone towards neuroticism. Well, perhaps another key factor in gun ownership is not just belief that the world is dangerous, but fear, and enough fear to motivate gun ownership. And perhaps that ownership may help ameliorate fear by providing a sense of safety not available to those who live in states with highly restrictive gun laws where you do see, seemingly, more neuroticism. We can learn more about gun ownership and fear by looking to a study from Dowd Arrow Hill and Burdett 2017, utilizing data from the Chapman University Survey on American Fears collected in 2014. This survey queried subjects on a variety of fears and phobias, from the more realistic, such as fear of being a victim of various crimes, to the less realistic, such as fear of zombies and ghosts.
If we summon the evil spirits, will you try to come kill us, please?
Yeah! Kill us!
They found that for each unit increase in the phobia index, or for each additional phobia, the odds of owning a gun were reduced by 5%, meaning people with more fears are less likely to own a firearm, which is the opposite of what one might expect. But if you haven't noticed, a lot of the data regarding firearms that we've looked at so far is seemingly contradictory to popular narratives. There were 3 exceptions to this general pattern. The odds of owning a gun were 40% lower for people who reported being afraid of animals, and 49% lower for those who were afraid of being mugged. In turn, the odds of gun ownership are 46% higher for people who are afraid of being victimized by a random or mass shooting. And that makes sense when you consider cases like that of Charles Whitman, often considered to be the first mass shooter, who, of all of his dumb ideas, perhaps the dumbest was to try to carry out that act in Texas. As such, the only indicator that gun ownership is related to fear is in the context of being concerned with mass shootings, not with muggings, robberies, other crimes, nor with general phobias. More specifically, the number of phobias a person reported was 9% lower for those who owned a gun. Similarly, gun owners had lower fears of being a victim of a crime than did non-owners. This reduced fear did not just apply to fear of criminal victimization, as the odds of reporting any fear of animals were 39% lower in those who owned guns compared to those who did not, and the odds of reporting any fear of heights were 27% lower for gun owners. And I have no idea why that is, as it's not exactly as if a gun can protect you from a fall, at least not at a scale usually widely available to consumers. While these data cannot tell us if gun ownership reduces fear or if gun owners just tend to be generally less afraid, we could speculate that gun owners feel safer in some areas of life due to owning that protective device. A speculation that would be supported by the fact that gun owners are not less afraid of the possibility of a mass shooting event than were non-owners. These findings may help explain the seeming disconnect between higher neuroticism and fear seen in states with stricter gun laws and fewer gun owners, and the high belief that the world is a dangerous place that's seen in gun owners. That is, owning a gun serves as a protective mechanism against fear of danger in the world not available to those in areas where guns are heavily restricted, which might also explain why gun owners may be just a little bit happier. Either way, gun owners do not appear to be paranoid as they are so often portrayed, and actually seem to be more well-adjusted, at least as it concerns phobias and fears that are non-owners.
I'd appreciate it if you'd deposit your weapon in the receptacle by the swinging doors, which concealing of it on your person in the first place was a violation of the rules of this establishment, and an offense against local norms.
And if I don't?
Another claim that has often been made regarding firearm owners is that more guns means more crime, and we can see this claim made frequently and currently in media coverage, but it's also been widely reported on in scientific studies. So, although fewer guns may mean more neuroticism in a statewide area, is it true that more guns does in fact mean more crime? To find out more, we can look to a methodological review of extant studies that examined the more guns, more crime hypothesis from CLEC 2014, who assessed 41 studies and found that almost none of them used direct measures of gun violence, instead relying on proxy variables. The only direct measure assessed across all of these studies was self-harm. The studies CLEC reviewed addressed many different types of crime, including burglary, robbery, assault, and homicide, but none of those crimes were directly related to gun ownership, instead serving as proxies, as it is impossible to determine that gun ownership directly led to those crimes, while self-harm can only be directly connected to the purchase of a firearm for that purpose, thus being left with only self-harm as a direct correlate against which to determine if gun ownership is related to crime rates. CLEC calculated year-by-year changes in both variables and found no correlation in 4 of the 9 regions assessed, with 5 correlations that did significantly differ from 0 being far too weak to indicate that self-harm was a good proxy for changes in gun prevalence, making it essentially a useless variable. Another problem that CLEC noted as it applies specifically to attempts to relate gun ownership to crime rates is that gun ownership rates are largely stable, rarely falling outside of the range of 44% to 52% of households between 1959 and 1993, Areas that did see major changes in rates of ownership saw changes in national polling that were so erratic as to be clearly due to methodological error or false reporting from subjects, with the rates of ownership in New England increasing from 16.6% in 1982 to 42.9% in 1984, a 158% increase in just 2 years. While perhaps it's possible that more than 3 million New Englanders purchased firearms in those 2 years, it's highly unlikely to say the least, unless of course they were reacting in fear to the birth of serial illithid botherer Matt Mercer, not knowing that Dr. Disrespect was born in the same year, and far more of a problem.
Doc like a rabid animal right now, getting ready for this third match.
And instead illustrative of a major flaw in national surveys regarding gun ownership. Kleck also noted that very few of the studies assessed confounding variables such as regional gun culture or losing all of one's guns in a mysterious boating accident.
Oh no! I'm having a boating accident!
And of these 6 studies that did control for confounds, not a single one found that increased gun ownership was related to increased violence rates. Another problem as it concerns studies looking to find evidence that more guns means more crime is that problem of causality. That is, do areas where people own more guns become more violent because of gun ownership, or do people in more violent areas buy more guns because of the violence? Of the 11 studies that did take causal order into consideration, every single one found that crime had a positive effect on gun ownership rather than the other way around. Looking specifically at homicides, of the 90 total findings across the 41 studies that Kleck had assessed, only 28, 31% were based on valid measures of gun prevalence, only 6, 7% were based on appropriate methods to address causal order, and only 11, 12% controlled for more than 5 variables. Only 4 findings were produced by research that met all 3 of the conditions Kleck laid out to establish causality, and only 10 were produced by research that met 2 or more of the conditions. If one were to look at the research more broadly, he or she would find that 52% of these studies found a significant, positive relationship between gun ownership and homicide rates. However, when methodological flaws were taken into consideration, the data paint a very different picture. Kleck found that when researchers used an invalid measure of gun prevalence, 62% of the homicide findings were positive and significant, but when a valid gun measure was used, only 36% of the homicide findings were positive and significant. Of the 37 homicide findings originating from studies that did not take causal order into consideration, 57% were positive and significant, but not a single study that included causal order in the analysis found such a relationship. When researchers controlled 5 or fewer significant variables, 59% of homicide findings were positive and significant, but when more than 5 significant control variables were controlled for, only 17% of the findings were positive and significant. The pattern that Kleck identified here is clear. The more methodologically accurate and stringent the research is, the less likely it is to find evidence for the hypothesis that more guns means more crime. I felt it important to go through all of those pretty dry statistics just to make it clear that when you hear somebody say that more guns means more crime, you need to be really careful about what data they're using to back up that claim, if any at all, because Kleck found that other scholars really were not treating the topic with the care and consideration that it so deeply deserves. So now that we've learned a lot about who tends to own guns and why, we should examine how crimes involving guns affect the attitudes and opinions of both gun owners and non-owners alike, to see how those events, which so frequently shake society to its core, affect how people see guns and gun rights. Tragedies often bring people together in sorrow and in mourning, but just as often can divide and create animosity regarding that tragedy's cause and the associated blame. When it comes to a tragedy involving the use of a firearm, the rift that tends to divide the country is frequently the firearm itself and the Second Amendment, at least in the United States. Thus, we should understand how these incidents alter or bolster existing opinions regarding firearms. Because this is a very sensitive topic, I will be avoiding certain words, and I will also be making a lot of jokes to try and lighten the mood, not because I find any of this funny, quite the opposite, but instead because the way that I deal with tragedy is through bad jokes. So with that in mind, let's examine the effects of tragedy on gun ownership and beliefs about firearms. There has long been a contention among politicians and the general public alike that shootings encourage copycat crime as a form of social contagion. So, do they? If that were the case, it might provide a strong rationale as to why news outlets and media companies should perhaps reduce their reporting on these events, despite the lucrative nature of such coverage. And sad as it is to say, if that were true, it might help explain why it seems that these horrific events so often occur in spikes or waves. So, is it true? Well, analysis from Towers et al. 2015 seemed to indicate, yeah, kind of. The researchers used data collected from USA Today regarding events in which 4 or more people were killed that occurred between 2006 and 2013, using information from the FBI, media reports, and police documents. And speaking of the FBI, if these things do tend to happen in spikes and waves, perhaps the better question is, what's the relationship to mass events and the timeline for the Bureau's budget and when it's up for review?
FBI, open up!
This assessment included 232 events, of which firearms were involved in 76% of instances. If nothing else, a very American percentage. The scholars also used data specifically regarding school incidents from the Brady campaigns to prevent gun violence, which included 220 events in the US between 1997 to 2013. Additional data on 477 mass incidents in the US that did not occur in a school between February 2005 to January of 2013 were also obtained from the Brady campaign. Based on the USA Today sample, mass events involving firearms with 4 or more people killed occurred on average every 12.5 days in the US. Thank you, Baltimore and Chicago.
Baltimore is literally S-tier murder capital. You will die. Welcome to Fun.
Based on the Brady campaign data, school, let's call them permanent field trips to avoid Susan's radar.
Please let this be a normal field trip with a friend? No way!
I hate hobos.
Occur on average every 31.6 days. Both the USA Today and Brady School sample showed evidence of contagion effects. On average, the temporary increase in probability that another event would occur lasts 13 days, and each incident incites at least 0.3 new incidents. Specifically, for school events, they were found to be contagious for an average of 13 days, and incite an average of at least 0.22 new incidents. They found that the prevalence of firearm ownership was significantly associated with statewide incidents of mass killings with firearms, field trips, and mass shootings. However, the stringency of state firearm legislation does not seemingly influence that contagion. Although states that have stronger gun laws tend to have lower rates of self-termination using a firearm, those laws don't appear to have much of an effect on the prevalence of these mass tragedies. For more recent data, we can look to a study from Fox et al. 2021, who examined short-term contagion that occurred following mass events since the year 2000. Incidents assessed in this analysis included those with 4 or more victims killed by gunfire in a public place. Between January of 2000 and December of 2018, they noted 6,940 accounts of these shootings in the media. They found that for the first decade or so, there was no apparent change in the prevalence or severity of these events. Since 2012, however, incidents have increased both in number and in severity. In turn, the extent of news coverage has also increased from 2012, particularly in the form of network television news reports. Major coverage tends to peak 2 days after the event, and while daily newspapers continue to cover the incident for about 2 weeks, for major networks, coverage generally wanes after just a single week. Non-public events, those that do not occur in a public area such as a domestic or gang-related dispute, yet which represent the overwhelming majority of these crimes, produced far less news coverage than did public events. In terms of contagion of these events influencing similar events, however, Fox and his colleagues could not confirm the findings of Tower et al. Namely, although news coverage related to mass shootings across multiple media sources was indeed linked to excitation from high-severity events, mass shootings themselves were distributed without significant social contagion effects. The authors further emphasized that although they could not find evidence that media reports increase incidences of mass violence, public animus may be exacerbated by media focus on more superfluous information, such as the criminal's personal background or planning process, rather than critical details about the case, such as demographic descriptions of the shooter, weapons used, and criminal processing. That is, it's possible that focusing on the shooter's motive may inspire copycat behavior, although there was no direct evidence for that hypothesis in these data. And the media does have a tendency to report on some gun crime over others. As previously mentioned, Fox et al.'s data were indicative that news organizations rarely paid much attention to mass shootings that did not occur in public. Despite the frequency of those events, however, just how skewed is media coverage of these violent incidents? For answers, we can look to a study from Kaufman et al. 2020, who examined the characteristics of victims in violent gun-related occurrences and news coverage of those occurrences in 2017 across 3 cities: Cincinnati, Rochester, and plain old simple normal Philadelphia.
Just heard the story of Hitchbot. Hitchbot was just trying to show the difference, or just show human cooperation with one another. So he would just hitchhike across the country and he's a robot. So like people have to just show their kindness. In Canada, he made it coast to coast. In the US, he was immediately beaten to death in Philadelphia.
Drawing from 6,000 local, regional, and national media sources and local police department data, they found that of the 1,801 firearm assault victims, only half were reported on by the news. Although this varied by city, with 46% of victims in Philly receiving coverage, 54.6% of victims in Cincinnati, and 65% in Rochester. Despite the fact that just 16% of shootings were fatal, these events were far more likely to be reported on in the media, with 83% of victims making the news compared to 43% of victims in non-fatal shootings. Similarly to the focus on fatal events over non-fatal ones, the news was also more concerned with the more severe instances of violence, as while only 22% of victims were injured as part of a multiple shooting, 76% of those victims made the news compared to 42.5% of single shooting victims. Although victims under the age of 18 were rare, comprising less than 8% of incidents, these events were covered far more frequently by the news, in 57.5% of cases, compared to events involving victims over the age of 18, of which 49.4% were covered. It appeared that news organizations were more likely to cover any shooting the more of them there had been in a single day, and thereby the worse the violence got, the more likely any individual victim would be to see coverage, such that in Philly, the city with the most gun crime of the 3 assessed, only 4.4% of victims of a shooting were covered in the news, when they were the only victim of a gun crime that day. Furthering the point posited by some scholars, not these and certainly not me, that journalists are blood-sucking parasites who fatten themselves on the carcasses of innocents. It seems then that people are unlikely to actually get very accurate coverage of the prevalence of violence committed using firearms from the news media, and given the focus on incidents that involve more than one victim, are fatal, and occur during periods of time when there has been more than one shooting, even if there is no contagion effect, as Fox et al.'s data were illustrative, news coverage may still give people a false perception that mass shootings are far more common than they actually are compared to other types of firearm crime, namely gang violence. It seems then that to some degree the media does set the agenda when it comes to emphasis on gun crime, with this coverage usually peaking about 2 days after a crime and then evaporating over the course of 2 weeks. Although more incidents does mean more coverage, and that coverage tends to be predominantly centered on mass public occurrences with multiple fatalities. So how exactly does the media tend to set that agenda? Agenda setting theory was proposed by McCombs and Shaw in 1972, and it posits that the media determines what topics people tend to think are most important, but not so much what people think about that news in terms of opinions or beliefs, so much so that the seminal study found an astonishing 0.97 correlation between what the media reports on and what issues people think are relevant. To get a better idea of how agenda setting applies to gun violence, we can look to a study from Jansky et al. 2017, who examined 375 news articles published in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post between September of 2012 and April of 2013, before and after Sandy Hook, concerning firearms to identify the framing used, who was blamed in these articles, and proposed methods of reducing violence. After the incident at Sandy Hook, all policy and media frames that were presented in articles published before the event became significantly more frequently cited, with special interest being the most common theme, followed by calls for sensible legislation, and then framing the issue as a concern for the will of the people, with that will, in these cases, being a desire for greater gun control. These issues were similar in comparative concern before Sandy Hook and after, the only change being the frequency of the framing. Entities blamed for gun crime, however, did change before and after the incident, as afterwards individuals were less likely to be blamed by news outlets, while lawmakers saw far more onus of responsibility. After Sandy Hook, the media began to focus far more on background checks, lethality reduction, mental health checks, and legislation to reduce gun trafficking. There was very little coverage of public health approaches to solving the problem, both before and after the event. About half of all articles were editorials, and editorials were more likely than fact-focused articles to mention changes in legislation. In opposition, stories rather than editorials were far more likely to attribute blame to the government. These results are then indicative that media tends to be far more likely to frame a story involving firearms from the perspective of the necessity of gun control laws and the public's desire for such legislation. After a shooting in particular, news coverage tends to downplay individual agency, focus on the role of lawmakers, and emphasize changes to policy, such as background checks and changes to firearms themselves, rather than public health concerns. While again, agenda setting does not influence opinions, it does set the stage for what issues people think are important. And as such, when the media does cover a shooting, and as we know, it's more likely to cover a large-scale violent event, it is also more likely to frame that event through the lens of needed change to gun laws, setting the agenda that the issue is guns far more so than it may be something like mental or public health. Major public events that involve guns inevitably raise the topic of greater concern for social consciousness, with many calling for increased gun control, while others emphasize the importance of gun ownership as a method of preventing or stopping these events outright, the good guy with a gun argument. So how do gun owners tend to react to information about incidents such as the Sandy Hook shooting? This question was assessed by Joslin and Hayder Markle 2017, utilizing data administered by the CNN Opinion Research Corporation and extracted from the Roper Center. Perhaps not the best sources, but let's look at what they found. Conducted about a month after the tragedy at Sandy Hook, respondents were asked, which of the following do you think is the primary cause of gun violence in America? The availability of guns, the way parents raise their children, or the influences of popular culture such as movies, television, and the internet. 41.5% of all respondents indicated that the influences of popular culture were the primary cause, followed by parents and family circumstances in 32.7%, and the availability of guns in 23%. At first, I was perplexed by the fact that people blamed the media more than parents, but I didn't consider that for a lot of children, the media is doing the parenting.
Let's see how many cunts got COVID today. Don't click on premium. What the f***? Touch your bacon, put it in my snout.
For gun owners specifically, they tended to split the blame between parents, 41.5%, and pop culture, 44.4%, while only 10% blamed the actual firearm. Specifically for non-gun owners, guns in and of themselves received far more blame, falling at 35.8%, while the other most commonly identified cause was pop culture at 37.6%. Additional surveying conducted by the researchers asked subjects more specific questions regarding the relationship between gun ownership and events such as those that occurred at Sandy Hook, which was not included in the CNN survey, asking them, quote, "In this country we have experienced a number of tragic mass shooting incidents in recent years. On a scale from 1 to 10, with 1 being none at all and 10 being a lot of blame, how much blame for these shootings do you place on the influence of violence in popular culture such as movies, television, and the internet, the availability of guns, the way parents raise their children, or on the shooters?" Similarly to the CNN poll, all subjects were less likely to blame gun availability than they were to blame parents and pop culture. Gun owners were nearly half as likely to blame guns as non-owners, while both groups were about equally likely to place the blame on the shooter individually. Groups with percentages of gun owners, namely Republicans and conservatives, were the least likely to blame guns, while Democrats, black people in general, and women, all of whom are less likely to own guns according to Pew data, were more likely to blame firearms for events such as Sandy Hook. In terms of predicting and preventing such events, gun owners were more likely than non-owners to believe shootings will happen again regardless of government and societal actions, and report that such events do not affect their opinions on 2A. In contrast, women, liberals, and Democrats, all of whom are again less likely to own firearms, preferred to view government and society action as effective, and increased in their support for gun control in relationship to these events. As such, it seems that people who are less likely to own guns tend to be more likely to attribute blame to the objects than are people that actually own guns, even in the face of recent tragedies. Two studies from Strobe et al. 2022 assessed opinions towards gun ownership surrounding the mass shootings at the Pulse nightclub and the El Paso Walmart in 2019. In their first study, the scholars had been collecting data on the subject between May and June of 2016. Then, following the incident in Orlando, they decided to conduct another round of data collection with which to compare the initial sample, a true natural experiment. Participants were asked about their political orientation and various beliefs regarding gun ownership, including the belief that gun ownership reduces crime. Those who already believed that an armed society is not a safer one were also more likely to be supportive of gun control laws, and the events at the Pulse nightclub only exacerbated those beliefs, increasing support for legislation. In contrast, those who believed that guns prevent crime were largely unaffected by the incident, with their support for legislation very slightly decreasing over time. A second study questioned subjects after the aforementioned incident in Orlando regarding opinions on what might have motivated the shooter, including access to firearms, and whether or not the incident could have been prevented if stricter controls were in place. Further, a third study replicated the methods of the second, this time with data being collected within 3 weeks following the shooting at the El Paso Walmart. Both surveys revealed that belief that guns reduce crime predicted whether people attributed these tragedies to the availability of guns, which in turn predicted support or lack thereof for stricter gun control laws. This belief also mediated the association between conservatism and gun ownership, largely overlapping variables, and support for or lack of support for stricter gun laws. Thus, because gun owners and conservatives tend to be more supportive of gun ownership, it seems that they are also less likely to blame guns for these violent events, and consequently tend to be less likely to support stricter gun control laws, even in the face of tragedies that so often spur political calls to action in restricting gun ownership. That is, those who already believe that guns prevent crime will only become more convinced of their pre-existing beliefs after a tragedy, while the opposite is the case for those who do not believe that gun ownership mitigates violence. Evidence of a kind of boomerang effect. This boomerang effect of shootings on beliefs regarding gun ownership was studied in more detail by Zhang 2018 through the framework of terror management theory and mortality salience. Mortality salience is the degree to which at any given time we are aware of the fact that we will inevitably die, and terror management theory predicts that we will attempt to cope with this inevitability through a variety of methods, including beliefs in an afterlife or beliefs that we will live on in the memories of others, which serve as a defense mechanism against the fear of death. Because thinking about our inevitable demise is unpleasant, when faced with information that evokes mortality salience via terror management, sometimes people will engage in dangerous behaviors seemingly in spite of that salience. For example, several studies have found that exposure to PSAs that emphasize the deadliness of binge drinking or smoking cigarettes actually tend to lead to increased binge drinking and smoking cigarettes in participants, increasing risk-taking behavior in the face of death.
Don't any of you have the guts to play for blood?
I'm your huckleberry.
To examine the boomerang effect in the context of beliefs about guns, Zhang first exposed some participants to a news article describing either the San Bernardino or Newtown shooting, and then all subjects were asked to complete a word fragment completion task to determine death thought accessibility. That is, someone who was thinking about death might be more likely to complete a word starting with the letters COF as coffin, while someone not thinking about death would be more likely to complete that word as coffee. Of course, around some Brits, requesting a coffee is likely to land one in a coffin, perhaps conflating these two specific words in terms of death thought accessibility.
Keep your sodding coffee in a proper cup of coffee pot and spot me loving teapot to your poncy rotten coffee shop.
Zhang found that those who read either article about a mass shooting were more likely to complete the task with words related to death. With this initial information in mind, that reading about a mass shooting increases death thought accessibility, Zhang conducted a second study wherein subjects' mortality was made salient by a series of questions regarding their thoughts on what happens after death and asked to think about emotions related to death or dying. Participants were then asked about their opinions on gun regulation and their attitudes towards open carry. Republican respondents whose mortality was made salient were less favorable towards gun control laws and more favorable towards open carry, while both Democrats, and to a lesser degree independents, whose mortality was salient, were more favorable towards gun control laws and less favorable towards open carry. Zhang conducted a third study to bring all of these concepts together, and this time some subjects were exposed to the articles about either the San Bernardino or Newtown shooting, and then were surveyed on their opinions towards gun control and open carry. The stimuli were effective, as all participants who read the articles about the shootings had greater death thought accessibility. However, there were differences across political groups as it concerned opinions towards firearms. Republicans were less favorable towards gun control laws, but independents and Democrats' attitudes towards gun control were largely unaffected. For open carry laws, Republicans were more favorable towards allowing citizens to open carry, while both independents and Democrats were less favorable towards open carry legislation. Thus, while Democrats and independents may become more supportive of gun control following news about a mass shooting, Republicans seem to fairly consistently be more likely to protest gun control legislation even after hearing about such an event. These findings could help explain why shootings seem so polarizing politically, because they are, and only exacerbate the depths of one's existing political beliefs regarding guns. Pointing out a tragic event to a Republican audience and expecting that audience to be swayed into changing their minds on guns, then, is not only not going to be persuasive, it actually is more likely to backfire and increase those Republicans' support for gun ownership and the Second Amendment. It seems that no matter how often these events occur, the needle just isn't moving, no matter what arguments one makes.
Listen, I want this gun, pal. Okay, I want it because it's easy to buy a gun. And I need to prove that to some people. So give me the gun at a fair price. And do it now.
4,000.
4,000. Really? I tell you what, how about I just take it, huh? Because I'm a maniac with a gun, and there's nothing you can do about it.
While guns are obviously deadly weapons, it's possible that shootings don't always elicit fear of death, but instead just create a general anxiety regarding the world being a dangerous place. The effect specifically of anxiety on attitudes towards gun policies then was assessed following the Pulse nightclub shooting in a study from Jocelyn and Hayter-Markle 2018 in a national level survey. Subjects' anxiety levels were measured and they were asked if they owned a firearm, what their political ideology was, and how much blame for the shooting they placed on the following possible causes: gun availability, terrorism, and mental illness. Very liberal participants were always more likely to blame guns, but placed the most blame on firearms when they were also high in anxiety. And liberals high in anxiety were far more likely to blame terrorism to a degree that their attributions of blame towards terrorism were similar to attributions from conservative respondents, while very liberal participants low in anxiety attributed very little blame to terrorism. Overall, 56% of participants favored new laws to restrict gun ownership, and in regards to specific questions about restrictions, 45% agreed with the statement that, quote, government and society can take action that will be effective in preventing shootings like Orlando. And 55% agreed with the statement, quote, shootings like the one in Orlando will happen again regardless of what action is taken by government. Anxiety had a significant influence on opinions, raising the likelihood of favoring restrictive gun laws from 0.4 among the least anxious to nearly 0.7 amongst the most anxious respondents. Anxiety also mediated the influence of political ideology, with the chances of less anxious liberals favoring gun restrictions being very high, 0.87, while being predictably very low for the least anxious conservatives, 0.08. Despite the low concern from less anxious conservatives, more anxious conservatives were fairly amicable towards new gun laws, as the likelihood that an anxious conservative favored such laws increased to nearly 0.5 and were more likely by a factor of 0.2 to believe that the government was capable of preventing shootings. Liberal and very liberal respondents were always more in favor of gun laws and believed in the benefit of government intervention, regardless of anxiety levels. Further, it seemed that anxiety mediated trust in the government in general, as low anxiety conservatives had very little confidence in the government, while very low anxiety liberals had the most confidence. While for individuals of either political orientation who were high in anxiety, confidence in government was relatively high and static. In short, people who trust the government to regulate firearms tend to be very anxious, while more laid-back people are more likely to want the government to piss off.
Well, let me see what the good book says. I think my vaccine passport, let me see where it says I need a vaccine passport. I think it says it right there.
Meanwhile, approval of Obama was largely unaffected by anxiety and aligned almost entirely along political lines. These data may be indicative then that even if death thought accessibility strengthens existing political aligned beliefs about guns, when conservatives are feeling particularly anxious, they may be more willing to accept government intervention and gun control legislation, while conservatives low in anxiety will become even more adamant in opposition to government involvement in restricting rights.
My idea of a perfect government is one guy who sits in a small room at a desk, and the only thing he's allowed to decide is who to nuke.
To better understand the seeming tendency to strengthen existing beliefs, we can look to another analysis that examined American attitudes towards guns and the influence of mass media following a shooting, specifically that at the Pulse nightclub from Jose, Holman, and Silver 2020. Survey data were collected at several points in time after the event, and respondents were questioned about their mental health history, political identity, gun ownership, recent exposure to violent events, direct exposure to the shooting in Orlando, media-based exposure to the shooting, and their attitudes towards firearms. Researchers found that about 61% of subjects advocated for stricter firearm laws, and 80% were in favor of universal background checks. Independents, Democrats, those with a bachelor's degree or higher, and non-gun owners all preferred stricter gun laws compared to Republicans, those without a bachelor's degree, and gun owners. While direct exposure to the incident had no effect, media exposure did, as respondents who were exposed to 1 or more hours of media covering the shooting were between 53 and 77% more likely to endorse stricter gun laws. Republicans, men in general, and gun owners were all less favorable of the implementation of universal background checks compared to Democrats and participants with higher education degrees. Relative to those who reported having no opinion on gun sales, subjects who watched 1 or more hours of related media were between 92 and 100% more likely to favor universal background checks when compared to those with less than 1 hour of media exposure. It seems then that media and its coverage of shootings can be particularly persuasive in actually changing opinions towards firearm legislation, in that while some may be unwavering in their attitudes, and others may even strengthen their attitudes as a form of boomerang effect, those whose minds are swayed following a tragedy are more likely to be those who have been exposed to more media coverage of the subject. You are not immune to propaganda.
At the end of the day, you're going to want something, and someone is always trying to sell it to you. You are not immune to propaganda, and you never will be.
Can we actually see some of the boomerang effect in relationship to gun sales immediately following a mass shooting? For answers, we can look to a master's dissertation from Osuna 2019, drawn from 19 years of gun sales data from 1998 to 2015, and taking into account numerous confounds, including 9/11, hunting season, and which political party was currently in power in the US government, all of which are factors that might encourage the purchasing of firearms.
I make this pledge to you today, I will never ever ride a bicycle.
She found that the occurrence of a mass shooting in the prior month was associated with an increase in gun sales by a unit of 312.71 thousand in the following month. At face value, that seems pretty extreme, but the predictive power of this model was non-significant, explaining 5% of variance in gun sales. When adding in all the other control variables, the explanatory power increased to 85%, but at that point, the mass shooting variable was no longer significant. In other words, no, mass shootings do not seemingly increase gun sales, at least not at the national level, and at least not in this analysis. Several studies have found evidence for increased applications for handgun carry permits and use of the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, or NICS, following a mass shooting. However, it seems that there isn't great evidence for such events to cause an increase in gun sales that was not better explained by other variables in Osuna's study, but we should still examine those data nonetheless. And we can start with Wallace 2015, who examined NICS background checks in association with recent shootings between 2000 and 2010. The NICS was mandated by the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act of 1993 and implemented in 1998, which allows for firearms dealers to ensure that there are no legal barriers to prevent a potential buyer from purchasing a firearm. However, this system is also used when applying for a concealed carry permit, and thus accessing the system may not be indicative of someone attempting to buy a gun. Moreover, plenty of guns are sold by private parties who aren't required to utilize NICS. With that in mind, however, nationwide, they found that mass shootings in Massachusetts, Illinois, and Missouri were positively associated with increases in NICS checks, even after controlling for monthly violent crime counts, state demographics, and the election of President Obama, as well as the frequency of Google searches related to gun control, the latter two of which may be indicative that the NICS access may have been due to people fearing further restrictions on firearm ownership. When Wallace removed Obama's election and Google searches from the model, the increase in NICS remained, indicating that a fear of restriction was not the sole cause for this uptick. Regionally, only the mass shooting events in North Carolina and Virginia were significantly associated with the log count of NICS checks. Unable to really find the strong evidence that she was looking for through these analyses, Wallace also examined the possibility for a lagged effect of NICS access and only found evidence for an immediate increase in access in Missouri and Illinois, while for other states, access tended to peak several months later, at which point I have to ask, can you even call that a reaction to the shooting? NICS requests overall increased after each shooting, but NICS requests increased across the board over time, making it impossible to make any causal inference. Unlike Osuna, Wallace didn't include hunting season into her analysis, which would be a reasonable alternative hypothesis as to why more people were trying to buy guns 3 or 4 months after a shooting rather than immediately following it. While this analysis may provide some evidence for the existence of a backlash to shootings in the form of increased access to NICS, not only does that again not necessarily mean that anyone purchased a firearm, only 2 states saw any kind of immediate increase in use of the system, meaning the evidence here just isn't robust enough to illustrate a boomerang effect. Perhaps this was just an issue with NICS data being low in resolution though, so for further evidence of the boomerang effect, we can look to a study from Turchin, Zeolite, and Kwiatkowski 2017, who examined handgun carry permit HCP applications in Tennessee between 2008 and 2014, during which time 10 events met the criteria for inclusion as a mass shooting. They found HCP application rates in the months containing a high-profile shooting were more than 11% higher than in months without such incidents. There was also an increase in applications following legislation in the state that expanded gun rights, being approximately 6% higher after these laws were enacted in May of 2009. More generally, conservative populations and unemployed individuals were more likely to apply during the assessed timeframe. Why were broke people more likely to apply for a handgun permit after a tragedy? Well, maybe because they're broke and worried the cops wouldn't be willing to help them. And why a handgun? Perhaps because the alternative is a little bit conspicuous.
Maybe. You'll end up like me. A hobo with a shotgun.
The model was weaker when they allowed for a spillover effect of HCP applications into the following month, given that some of the shootings occurred near the end of the month. But when that time frame was expanded to 2 months, any relationship between HCP applications and the shootings collapsed. When including local incidents that occurred in Tennessee specifically, but did not meet the other criteria, shootings continued to be significant in predicting HCP applications, but the magnitude of the effect was reduced. The researchers were also concerned that HCP renewals could skew the data and found the same increase in only new HCP applications. In total, their models indicated that certain high-profile mass shootings were associated with an increase between 11% and 14% in HCP application rates. Again, this does not mean these people actually purchased a handgun, nor even that they obtained a permit, only that they applied for one, a process that can take between 6 and 12 weeks. So while people may be more likely to apply for a handgun permit, and there are more logs in the NICS system following a shooting, albeit to minor degrees, what does that actually mean for the procurement of firearms? While Osuna's data seem to indicate longitudinally about SWAT, Schroeder et al. 2017 did find some changes in gun acquisitions directly following the San Bernardino and Newtown shootings in Californians. Using data from the California Department of Justice dealer record of sale between 2007 and 2016, the authors were able to see exactly how many firearms were purchased in the state on a weekly basis. In the 6 weeks following both the Newtown and San Bernardino shootings, there was an increase of 53% and 41% respectively over expected sale volume. Acquisition rates were 75% higher than average among women and 48% higher among men in the 6 weeks after Newtown, and were 50% higher among women and 38% higher among men following San Bernardino. White acquisition rates were 62% and 47% higher, and Hispanic acquisition rates were 43% and 50% higher on average, again, respectively, following both shootings, while Black acquisition rates were largely unaffected. After the Newtown shooting, acquisitions were 50% higher in San Bernardino County specifically, and after the San Bernardino shooting, rates were 85% elevated compared to 35% statewide. New acquisitions were between 72% and 59% higher than anticipated, while repeat purchases were 35% and 29% above expectations in the 6 weeks after each event. While this might sound like massive increases in procurement, these two spikes accounted for less than 10% of all handgun sales in California in their respective years. Even so, these data are illustrative that, at least in California, there was a marked increase in handgun acquisitions in the 6 weeks directly following a shooting, specifically among women local to the region where the event occurred. And because it was California, my condolences to all of the innocent firearms that were also needlessly modified. Oh, and speaking of the California DOJ dealer record of sale, yeah, the department recently accidentally made all personal information processed through the system public for a couple of hours in June of 2022. No, it wasn't hacked. The department just made a bit of an oopsie and doxed every firearm owner in the state. Surely all just a coincidence so shortly after the Supreme Court ruling. Excellent work, Gavin Newsom.
Whoa, whoops, oh! I dropped my monster condom that I used for my Magnum.
While the scholars did not collect political party demographic data, San Bernardino County does lean Democrat, with 54% of the population voting blue in 2020, and relative to the rest of California, the county does have a lot of Republicans as well, which might help explain why there were these unique effects in the San Bernardino area comparatively to the statewide level of acquisitions. Even without specific information regarding political party identification from Schroeder et al., we've seen fairly consistently that politics play a part in how opinions or even behaviors, as it concerns purchasing a gun or seeking a permit, can change following a shooting, or not change. As a wise man once said though, opinions are like buttholes, everyone's got one, so the important question is, do these opinions actually influence elections? To find out, we can look to a study from Garcia Montoya, Arona, and Lacombe 2021, who collected data on the field trip events that occurred between 1980 and 2016, with several details on each attack, including its geographical location, and compared those data to electoral outcomes during the same time span. While they found no effect of shootings on voter turnout in general, support for the Democrat Party was significantly increased in vote share in counties that experienced these incidents by 4.5 points on average for both fatal and non-fatal shootings. There was also a spillover effect in that counties in close proximity to those that were the location of one of these events were also more likely to shift their vote share towards the Democrats. This shift was slightly smaller in swing states, where changing one's vote is more likely to also change the outcome of an election, but significant nonetheless. The number of days between the shooting and the election did not affect this pattern, indicating that the effects are somewhat perennial. Any shooting seemingly causes a shift towards the Democrat Party in voting. Although, again, there was no evidence in these data that shootings influenced turnout, they did persistently increase support for Democrats at the voting booth. These effects were more prominent in areas with more lenient gun control laws than those with stricter laws, which may be statistically because those areas with stricter laws are already more likely to have a larger percentage of Democrat voters. A nearly identical, albeit somewhat smaller pattern was present in regions when broken down by designated market area used to define radio and television markets rather than by county, illustrating that the proximity of media coverage regarding a shooting has the same kind of effect on increasing support for the Democrats at the ballot box. In a very morbid manner then, it's actually in the best interest of the Democrat Party for there to be more shootings rather than less, if only because it increases voter support for their party, and particularly in areas with less restrictive gun control legislation. And as we saw earlier, Republicans just kind of don't tend to be influenced by these events, while independents are. So I reiterate. And with all of that in mind, let's come to a few conclusions. Today, we examined the various reasons why Americans own guns and how they feel about gun ownership, and we found a lot of what we might have expected. It is predominantly white men who own firearms, sure, but it's far more complicated than that. People own guns predominantly for hunting and for self-defense, although which rationale is more common depends on the type of firearm. And for those who do own guns for the purpose of self-defense, it seems those people may be a little bit more likely to see the world as something of a dangerous place. Despite being more likely to see the world as dangerous, these people don't seem to be statistically more neurotic or higher in anxiety, and may actually be happier. And despite all the claims I'm sure you've heard to the contrary, gun owners seem to be less likely to hold racist beliefs than non-owners. Mass tragedies only seem to polarize and reinforce existing beliefs that people hold about guns, such that gun owners are not highly likely to feel motivated to turn in their guns even after an atrocity has been committed with a similar firearm. While there is some evidence that gun sales increase following such an event, the data don't seem to be indicative that this tendency is the result of potential copycat behavior, but instead perhaps because it evokes those feelings of the world being a dangerous place that we know is more common in gun owners, and out of a concern that the government will take action to restrict access to firearms, which is something that people who don't own firearms are more likely to call for following such an incident, and which we can see happening as the US government moves to implement more red flag laws after the Uvalde shooting. So the concern there is not misplaced. In summation, gun owners aren't statistically irrational, paranoid, racist old white men, and instead tend to be people with very reasonable concerns for their own protection, or people who just want to go hunting. And attempts from the news media to politicize a tragedy and call for the implementation of stricter gun control does not tend to have any effect on swaying the opinions of those who already own and support the ownership of guns. So, if you want to try and convince a gun owner to hand over his or her property, attributing the deaths of innocents to a firearm rather than to the monster who pulled the trigger is probably not an effective method of trying to pry the gun from their fingers. But hey, what do you guys think? Do you own guns, and if so, why? For hunting, for sport, for self-defense, all three? Do you think gun ownership is a fundamental right as an American citizen, or should there be limits on that right? And if so, why? Would stricter gun laws prevent tragedies like that in Uvalde? Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below, and while you're down there, if you've enjoyed this video, be sure to click like and hit the bell to be updated when I do upload a new video, which, considering their length, do take a while to put together. If you want to see more from me, I do a podcast every Wednesday at 8:30 GMT, 3:30 EST with my co-host Spoon over on the Broken Crown channel, and now every Tuesday at 9 p.m. GMT, 4 p.m. EST, where we run a tabletop role-playing game featuring Uzalu, Kami Mark, myself, and some other friends, if you're interested in watching some RPG shenanigans. I also want to give an enormous thank you to all of my supporters on Patreon and Subscribestar who allow me to make these videos, particularly ones like this that are definitely not the kind of subject matter that YouTube wants to promote. You all are absolutely amazing, and if you want to see your name here on the screen with these fine folks, you can find links to support down below, along with links to my sponsor. Once again, thank you all so much for watching, and as always, dear friends, Altana Volt.
All the gold and the